Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and normally what I do in these lecture videos is go over the reading, but in this case he didn't have a reading assignment. I had asked you to listen to this audio resource, which is a podcast episode from the Philosophy Bites site, and in that interview you had a philosopher, a guy by the name of Frank Jackson, talk about the theory of epiphenomenalism through his very famous thought experiment titled, What Mary Knew. And I'll say up front that if you've already listened to that audio resource, which hopefully you have, if you've already listened to that, you know that Frank Jackson changed his mind later on in life. And so for the purpose of this video, we're going to be talking about the early Frank Jackson. So whenever I say, whenever I describe Jackson's position, I'm not describing Jackson's position as it is now in the year 2025. I'm describing Jackson's position as it was, 30 years ago. Whenever he was making these types of arguments. Frank Jackson used to be a dualist, a very specific version of dualism that we call epiphenomenalism, which I'll talk about in a moment whenever I get to describing this chart. Frank Jackson abandoned those views and now considers himself to be a card-carrying materialist, meaning that he's a complete physicalist whenever it comes to mind. So again, we're going to be sort of, ignoring Jackson's later views for the purpose of this video and for the purpose of, analyzing this audio interview. Excuse me. And so, again, just to repeat, whenever I say Jackson, it's not the current Frank Jackson, it's the Frank Jackson of that famous thought experiment. And Frank Jackson came up with that thought experiment to advocate for a particular version of dualism, a version of dualism called epiphenomenalism. And the reason why Frank Jackson was doing that was because he was trying to respond to some of the criticisms, to hold on to his dualist intuitions, while at the same time responding to criticisms of the theory of dualism. And what I mean by hold on to dualist intuitions is something along the following lines, that, a lot of people have this intuitive belief that body and mind are connected. Again, with mind understood in something non-physical terms. So just an example would be, you remember that you're out of milk, right? So according to a dualist, somebody like Descartes, the act of remembering, having a memory, that's a mental event. So it's non-physical. But notice that that non-physical event can cause you to put on your blinker and, if you're driving on the highway and you remember that you're out of milk, remembering non-physical, putting on your blinker physical, taking the exit physical, parking at the grocery store physical, walking into the grocery store physical. So a lot of people have thought, well, surely there's a connection between mind and body. And similarly, not only can, not only do some people have this intuition that the mind can affect the body, that a mental state can bring about a physical state. They also believe a physical state can bring about a mental state. So like a physical state of being in chronic pain can lead to this mental state of depression, right? So a lot of people have those intuitions, but we pointed out in our discussion of Gilbert Ryle, and his criticism of Descartes, that a lot of those dualist arguments don't really hold up to a high degree of scrutiny. So Frank Jackson comes along, I think in the late 1970s, and he is wanting to offer a version of dualism that at one and the same time can sort of allows people to hold on to their dualist intuitions while at the same time avoiding criticisms of Descartes' version of dualism. So just as a reminder, I have this graphic here of what Cartesian dualism would look like. Remember, Cartesian dualism, also called substance dualism, is the idea that you have two different types of substance. So this top row here, that's the mind, or mental events, mental stuff. This bottom line here represents the brain, the body, physical stuff. And remember that Cartesian dualism, substance dualism, is interactive dualism, meaning that somebody like Descartes thinks that the mind can interact with the body, and he also thinks that the body can interact with the mind. And of course, he believes that the mind can affect the mind, that one mental event can bring about another mental event, and that one physical event can bring about some other physical event. Now, we saw Ryle's criticism of that. Ryle's criticism is that this is just way, way complicated, right? Maybe we can understand how one physical event can bring about another physical event, and how that can bring about another physical event. But these types of reactions here, how can the non-material mind interact with and bring about some event in the physical universe, right? That's what we really have difficulty attempting to explain. So all of this up here is meant to give you a graphic representation of what Cartesian dualism is committed to. Now down here, this is a graphic representation of what Frank Jackson is going to be suggesting. Epiphenomenalism is still a form of dualism. So we still have this top row here, which represents the mental, right? A different kind of stuff, a different type of event. And we still have this bottom row here. So two different types of stuff still. That's what makes it a dualist theory. But it's a special kind of dualism called epiphenomenalism. What Jackson's going to say is that these mental events up here, mental event 1, mental event 2, mental event 3, those mental events are themselves causally inefficacious, meaning that they don't do anything. They're not a genuine phenomenon. They're just a surface phenomenon, right? That's what the prefix epi means. You have epithelial cells. Your epithelial cells are just your skin cells, right? Because they're on the outermost, or just on that outer surface. So to describe something as epiphenomenon is basically a way of sort of downrating it. It's not a real phenomenon, it's an epiphenomenon. And so this version of dualism, Jackson thinks, allows us to avoid some of the criticisms that are associated with Descartes' version of dualism, again, while holding on to some dualist intuitions that some people have. And not everyone has dualist intuitions, by the way, but some people do. And we're going to be entering this through a specific set of vocabulary terms, a vocabulary term of qualia, which again, if you've already listened to this audio interview, you've heard that piece of terminology. And there's another piece of terminology here that is not in that audio interview. The terminology of what philosophers call the explanatory gap. And what philosophers mean when they talk about the explanatory gap is a gap between an objective reconstruction of an event and the subjective experience of the event. Sometimes the explanatory gap is referred to as the what is it likeness. There is something that it's like to have a conscious experience, right? There's something that it's like to taste a hard-boiled egg. Hard-boiled eggs have a very peculiar taste. And according to this view, a physicalist account can't explain what the conscious experience of the taste of a hard-boiled egg is. Even if you understood exactly how the taste buds worked, and even if you understood at the physical level every single ingredient and chemical that is in a hard-boiled egg, you still wouldn't know what a hard-boiled egg tastes like, right? So that's the explanatory gap. And that gap, according to some philosophers, is what suggests that there has to be something in addition to the physical, right? because on this hypothesis, we have all the physical information, right? We understand all the chemicals that are in a hard-boiled egg, and we understand how taste buds work. But even if we had all of that complete physical information, we still don't know what a hard-boiled egg tastes like until we actually taste a hard-boiled egg. So the thought experiment that Frank Jackson gives us and what Mary knew is designed to sort of point those things out. He asks us to imagine a color scientist, this person, Mary, who has devoted her entire life to studying color and analyzing color. But herself, she has lived in this black and white environment, and color has been hidden from her for the entirety of her life. So she's read all these books, and she understands the theory of color in terms of, wavelength and reflective coefficients, using all those terms from physics. But she's never seen the color red, for example. So now, with that setup, Frank Jackson asks us to imagine the scenario where Mary steps outside of that room one day and sees the color red for the first time. Not just having read about it, not just knowing what the frequency is and what the reflective coefficients is, but actually experiences the color red. Now, the thought experiment was designed to lead to a certain conclusion. And the conclusion that the early Frank Jackson thought that it led to was that Mary would actually learn something about the color red, that conscious experience, that qualitative experience. That's why we refer to these states as qualia. That experience of seeing red is filling in this gap between complete physical explanation, a complete physical description, and the conscious experience. And what the dualist, in this case the epiphenomenalist, is going to suggest is that there are certain experiences that we have that constitute and demonstrate the existence of mental events. That mental events, that conscious experience, are these qualia. Qualia, just by definition, is the subjective experience of consciousness, the peculiar feeling of what a rose looks like in comparison to like another red object, right? The experience that you have, the subjective conscious experience that you have when you look at an apple, is different from the subjective conscious experience you have whenever you look at a rose. Now, in both cases, there's just, your retina's picking up on these photoreceptors. And those photoreceptors are activating certain cells in your optic nerve that's sending this electrochemical signal to the brain in which this image is constructed, right? Now, all of those things can be measured objectively. We can measure, the electrochemical impulse that is activated and is sent when it is activated by your visual receptor cells. But that doesn't give us an account of what the conscious experience of seeing a rose is. Similarly, if you think about pain, the pain that you experience when you get a paper cut is different from the pain that you experience when you stub your toe on a piece of furniture. Now, from the standpoint of just anatomy, whenever you stub your toe or whenever you get a paper cut, the experience of pain is just the result of this specialized cell that biologists refer to as C fibers. It's just a C fiber stimulating. So notice that you can objectively measure what the C fiber being stimulated is, but stubbing your toe feels different, right? It has a qualitative, conscious difference from getting a paper cut. In both cases, there's just C fibers that are being stimulated, but they feel very different. And so that felt conscious experience, that qualia, is constituting this explanatory gap, a gap between a complete physical description of the world and the conscious experience of it. So thus, the epiphenomenalist, which is a version of dualism, is going to say that that explains both those dual-natured experiences, right? We have both mind and body. We have both body and mind. I think that was the spatial orientation there. So now let me return to this visual chart here. I've already explained the top half of this, so now let's go down and explain this bottom half. This is epiphenomenalism. So remember what I said earlier, that Frank Jackson is wanting to offer a version of dualism that avoids some of those criticisms. And with that major criticism that Ryle was offering, which was just a slightly different version of the question that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia was asking Descartes. How can something material interact with something non-material? Jackson's going to attempt to answer that question. What he's going to say is that, well, clearly a physical event can bring about a physical event. So body event 1, right here, can bring about body event 2. So body event 1, I step on a tack. That's clearly a physical event, right? Now, as a result of that physical event causes this physical event, that body event 2, a C fiber being stimulated, right? And that could lead to body event 3, me, if I'm the person that stepped on a tack, that can lead to body event 3. I could be jumping up and down in pain, or I might be crying, or I might be cussing, right? All of those are physical body events. So we can see how body event 1 leads to body event 2 leads to body event 3. That isn't controversial, right? What is controversial is, well, how can the body bring about a mental event? Well, what Jackson suggests is that stepping on a tack resulted not in one thing, but in two things. I step on a tack, and that causes this second body event to occur. So body event 1, stepping on a tack, body event 2, C fibers being stimulated. But at the same time, there's this other event. There is this mental event, pain. As I said earlier, that, a C fiber being stimulated is just what pain is. But notice that you can study C fibers your entire life and still not know what a paper cut feels like if you haven't had a paper cut, right? You can study C fibers your entire life and still not know what it feels like to have your hand slammed in a car door if you haven't had your hand slammed in a car door. That's qualia, right? That is a qualitative, conscious experience. Now, what Jackson's going to say, and this is how he's going to attempt to avoid some of those criticisms typically directed at dualism. What Jackson, again, the early Jackson here, what Jackson said was that body event, stepping on a tack, at one and the same time, it gave rise to this event, which is a physical event, the stimulation of a C fiber, but it also gave rise to this mental event of pain. Now, here's how he's going to try to avoid the criticism of Descartes' version of dualism. The pain isn't what causes me to jump up and down and cry, right? The pain is the mental event. It just does nothing. Again, it's causally inefficacious. It arises from a physical event, and it presents itself as a mental event. But the mental event does not interact. The mental does not interact with the physical. The mental is this causally inefficacious byproduct of a prior physical event. So I step on the tack here. The C fiber is stimulated here. I jump up and down and cry here. Body event 1, body event 2, body event 3. I do in fact experience pain, and it is mental, according to Jackson, this version of Jackson. But again, the reason why I'm jumping up and down and crying, it's not because I'm in pain. It's because a C fiber was stimulated. and we can explain the relationship between my behavior and my mental state by going back to this earlier physical state. Now, in offering this, Jackson thinks that he's offered a simplified version of dualism that avoids these problematic concerns that philosophers have been asking at least since the time of Princess Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. Jackson thinks, well, the earlier Jackson thought that this version of dualism, it allows us to maintain this distinction between mind and body, which a lot of people like. And at the same time, it helps to avoid some of the problems associated with other versions of dualism. A note of criticism here, a problem. What Jackson is suggesting is, again, that we have these mental events that don't do anything. Which brings up this question. If the mental event of pain doesn't do anything and doesn't cause us to do anything, if it's causally inefficacious, then we can't even begin to explain why we would experience such a mental event in the first place. And so it defies an evolutionary account. Now, of course, you don't have to accept evolution. But the problem is that evolution is a pretty good explanation, and we use it to explain a lot of human behaviors. And it would remain unclear as to why, evolution would be so successful in explaining all those other human behaviors and why certain things happen, but isn't at all helpful in giving us an account of why we experience pain. Because we can't say that the pain leads to this adaptive response that helps us flourish better in our environment, because that would be to suggest a causal connection between a mental event and a physical event. But Jackson's whole point, at least at this point in his career, right? Jackson's whole point is that the mental event doesn't do anything and doesn't bear a causal role in any of our actions. And so even this sort of downgraded version of dualism still faces difficulty. And that's why we're going to be continuing this conversation in a different lecture video in which we talk about some physicalist alternatives, some material alternatives to the conception of mind, as opposed to the dualist conception of mind that we've been talking about up to this point. So with all those things being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. I'll ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next video.